Welcome back, listeners. So, Josh, in the first segment, we just gave a general recap of corn and soybean harvest progress across the area, some considerations around some of the alfalfa across the areas if you're needing to kill that off before next year, and then the green beans we're seeing in some of these fields. But as we move into this segment, I'm kind of going to make a little reference to, we have one of our counterparts to the west, and he always talks about how, you never forget to check the oil in your truck. And he talks about similarly to how we don't forget to check the oil in our truck, it's always important, to have a nice gauge of where our fertility levels are sitting across these acres. So maybe a little bit of a cheesy reference there, but I think it is, kind of a nice correlation there. So, I think there's some things that maybe we've seen trend-wise in the past couple of years. And as we move into this year, I think there's some points around fertility that are definitely worth hitting on and making sure we communicate to the masses.
Yeah, I've had a few growers reach out and kind of want to go through their fall spread plan and with some of the beans and even the corn coming off there, they're just looking at, getting a jump start on this before, while the weather, the fields aren't too muddy yet. We've had a little bit of rain, but the fields are still holding up good. So wanting to get a jump start on that. And, one of the things we've kind of discussed as we went through some of these plans of what to spread this fall is kind of looking back at the previous 2-3 years here where, fertilizer prices have been a little bit elevated. The farm commodity price has been a little bit off where, the last couple of years really going through crop nutrition plans, we've maybe tried to sharpen the pencil a little bit, really, study out our soil sample data, where do we got some really good levels, where are we sitting, maybe where we need to be, where we're a little low and maybe trying to redirect where we're putting fertilizer, maybe trying to save a little bit here, put a little extra there, just maintain here, has kind of been the philosophy here to, I'm not saying we're limping along. We're still trying to be aggressive and make sure we're maximizing yield, but we've maybe pulled the reins back just a little bit as the farm economy got tight. And as we kind of worked through some of these, we were going through, we took off some pretty good, bean yields, some pretty good corn yields. And really what we kind of found with the fertilizer price and changing is that, maybe if we're looking at spending a similar dollar amount as last few years, we're able to bump up rates a little bit. In some cases, maybe bumping potash, 15, 20%, or maybe 25% in some cases, just depending on what we want to do there. But yeah, potash price is pretty attractive right now. Phosphorus is still up there a little bit. So, we're maybe not being as aggressive on that. But there are some opportunities to maybe take a look at that. And really, if you look at its history, Allie, I always look at fertilizer. I always view it as a commodity. However, we tend to buy a lot of fertilizer when it's really expensive because the corn and bean price is really good. And we tend to buy very little fertilizer when it's lower in price because the corn and soybean pricing is good. So we always tend to buy fertilizer backwards. We tend to buy a whole lot when it's expensive. We don't buy very much when it's inexpensive. But in most cases this year, we're maybe trying to push rates a little bit higher. And that might be something as you're working through that, just go through some numbers and really look at what have I been spending, what have we been spreading, what have we been removing. And I think all that goes into that. And Allie, I think the other thing, I briefly referenced it, but I always like to go through what are we getting for corn and bean yields, because that's really what should drive what the bare minimum we should spread as we prepare for the 2021 crop.
Yeah, and I don't think it's going to be any surprise to anyone. We are going to, again, this year, hear some big yield numbers likely. And just as a general maybe scenario, if you look at a 220 bushel corn crop, you figure you're removing about 80 pounds of P2O5 and, a little over 65 pounds of K2O. And you look at a 70 bushel soybean crop, that's 56 pounds of P2O5 and over 100 pounds of K2O. So, just to put some general numbers to maybe what you're likely to see across your fields. And I think along with that, it's important to just have that understanding, like we mentioned earlier, of what are those soil test results across our fields. You look at maybe some of these drier conditions we've had down the stretch. Any specific thoughts on, as we're sampling, what are maybe some different areas of where we want to spend that money between grid or zone sampling, and then timing this year too, just like I mentioned, maybe being a little bit drier down the stretch.
Yeah, one thing I'm always a little bit careful of in fall sampling, if we've been really dry and we've had a little bit of moisture here, but not a lot of rain, but sometimes on a dry year we can see potassium soil tests come back a little lower than expected. And one thing I like to do is once you get the crop out is if we can get maybe an inch or two of rain and maybe 2-3 weeks time, we can get some of that to kind of release out of residue and maybe pick up on that a little bit more. But that's just one call out that we tend to see on a drier season, which we were pretty dry in August and into September here, but that might be one consideration. And then you also, referenced kind of that removal. One thing I noticed Sometimes when I go through growers' fall spread plans or their P&K plan, is sometimes it's maybe a very similar spread for the corn ground and the bean ground of how much potash and phosphorus we're applying. But in general, it's always important to remember that the soybean crop is a much larger remover of potassium. So it's going to take more potash out of the ground. The corn crop's the opposite. It's going to take a lot more phosphorus out of the ground. So when you're ever looking at, how much do I need to put back, in most cases, we should be applying a lot more potash after the beans because we took a lot more off the field, and we should be spreading more phosphorus after the corn because we took a lot more of that out there. Now, there's two ways to think of it. You can look at what did I take to want to put back, or what am I preparing? That's kind of always two ways to look at that. What am I preparing for versus what did I take? But I always like to look back, how much did I remove? What do I got to put out there to set the crop up for success next year? And with that, Allie, we'll probably call this show a wrap, and we'll be back 1 week from today. And I think we'll have a whole bunch more yield results, and hopefully some plot results and some agronomy stuff, and we'll go from there.
You've been listening to Today in Agronomy on KFIL AM 1060. If you've missed part of the show or want to hear more, check out the show page at kfilradio.com or with the 103.1 KFIL app. Stay connected with Allie and Josh on Twitter. It's at Allie G-Wise, W-I-S-E, and at Josh Schaffner to submit your questions for the show. Tune in next Wednesday for the next Today in Agronomy on KFIL AM 1060.